So I'm going to be talking today about personhood concepts in China and specifically the role of vital energy. All right, so I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start by talking about the theoretical background behind personhood conceptions, or research on personhood conceptions in the cognitive science of religion literature and also the developmental psychology literature. Then I will talk about vitalism and its role as a component of personhood. And I'll discuss the possible role of personhood concepts in understanding illness with the focus of vitalism. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about children's understanding of how people get sick, what we know from the developmental psychology literature. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about traditional Chinese medicine and the research that we've done on Chinese children's understanding of how people get sick. So how we think about persons shapes how we think about health, illness, the afterlife, morality, and also supernatural agents, religious ideas. And in the cognitive science of religion, the understanding of what constitutes a person has been considered to be foundational. And representations of supernatural agents, such as gods and ghosts, depend on ordinary cognition, according to naturalness theory. And when we think about ordinary persons, we have certain ideas, we have certain inferences about what constitutes a person and how they work. So we expect people to have minds, have mental states, and those mental states, like beliefs and emotions, we expect them to guide behavior, and we make predictions based on that. We also expect people to have bodies, to have physical bodies and biology. And supernatural agents, they share some of these features with ordinary persons, but they might not necessarily have all those features. They might not have physical bodies, such as ghosts, who have a mentality but don't have physical bodies. So how do we think about persons, especially these non-material aspects of persons? What are the cognitive foundations of our conceptions of persons? So although there is, across culture, we seem to have these conceptions that there's something beyond the physical body. And although there is some cultural variation in ideas of bodily and immaterial aspects of persons, there are some cross-cultural similarities that suggest that certain cognitive foundations may underlie ideas of these different conceptions. And there's widespread belief, for example, of afterlife beliefs, that some aspect, some immaterial aspect of persons continues after death. And there are a couple of different approaches in the cognitive science of religion and developmental literature. So, for example, psychologists Paul Bloom and Jesse Baring, they argue that people are intuitive dualists, that people think about others as having a mind or a soul and a body, so separated into those two. But other researchers have argued, well, maybe it's not that simple. Maybe there are other aspects, other immaterial aspects that constitute ideas of personhood. So research by psychologists such as Rebecca Rickert and Paul Harris, they've shown that even children think about things like soul and mind as functionally distinct. We use our minds for thinking, but soul might have more to do with a relationship with perhaps a higher power or with morality. So there might be more to this. So my research involves developing conceptions of what constitutes a person. What do children think, and how does this change over time? And perhaps, how is it similar or different across cultures? So, persons have bodies, but personhood involves more than just physical bodies. Emma Cohen and Justin Barrett have proposed that personhood notions are comprised of three components. There's mentality or mind, identity or soul, and vitality or vital force or life force or vital energy. And the cognitive systems that are suggested to underlie these three components are theory of mind, which we've talked a little bit before in Justin's talk, essentialism and vitalism. So theory of mind is the attribution of mental states to others, and so things such as beliefs and desires and emotions, and using these mental states to predict behavior. Now, essentialism is the idea that it's a psychological belief that individuals have essences, an unobservable essence that serves as the cause of behaviors. So when we apply it to, let's say, natural kinds, tigers have a tiger essence. That essence basically produces the behaviors and the features that allow us to identify one tiger as part of the group of tigers, even though not all tigers might look the same. Now, it's argued that perhaps we also have an individual essence that helps us identify an individual from the time that they're a baby to an older person. You don't look the same as you did when you were a baby, and the cells in your body have changed. So, but how is it still you? So, essentialism might be one way to help us keep track of individuals across time, and even though outward appearances might change. And then the third component is vitality, and this draws on vitalistic causality from the domain of intuitive or naive biology that Li Qi talked about. So this is the idea that energy is behind the functioning of living things. And supernatural persons that lack bodies may also be conceived as having these more immaterial aspects of personhood. So in my research, I've been focusing on vitality. So is vitality a foundational aspect of our idea of the person, and what is the cognitive basis for this aspect? So the idea of vitality or life force or vital energy stems from the idea that living things are infused with something that gives them life and that distinguishes them from non-living things. And there's some evidence that children draw on a uniquely biological sort of reasoning, vitalism, early on in development. And so this is research that's been done by Inagaki and Hitano. So vitalistic causality, as defined by those researchers, involves a transmission or exchange of the vital force, which can be conceptualized as unspecified substance or energy or information. And research indicates that children in the US and Australia and Japan between the ages of 6 to 8 draw on vitalistic causality to explain the functioning of the body. And in addition, vitalistic causality has been shown to serve as a framework for children's understanding of life and death, and also within the domain of biology, vitalistic reasoning has also been demonstrated in children and adults' understanding of nutrition. So vitality is the immaterial aspect of the person that is most connected to the body. And so it might have some implications in how people think about health and illness and folk medicine. So different aspects of the person, vitality or mind or individual essence, may be susceptible to problems, and thus might be important in understanding illness. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that. So how do we get from conceptions of the person to understanding of illness? So we've talked about afterlife beliefs. Death in the afterlife is one context in which we can think and examine conceptions of personhood. But I think illness is another context where we can examine this. When things go wrong with our bodies, do we assume that the problem only concerns our body, or are other aspects of the person involved? Is it only the body and biological functioning? And as a developmentalist, I also want to know, well, what do children think? do children make that assumption? So, sometimes things go wrong with our bodies. We get symptoms, and what we believe is the cause of those symptoms will influence the treatment. So if we have a headache, and we think, well, let's see, I haven't had my morning cup of coffee. That must be why I have a headache. So I go and I get a cup of coffee. And in the US, there are examples like mothers, they warn their children to put their coats on when they go outside when it's cold and rainy because they don't want them to catch cold. But if they do, they'll give them maybe some chicken noodle soup to help in their recovery. And there are suggestions just in common lore that illness could be caused by emotions or even curses, supernatural means, but could also be cured by supernatural means, perhaps by prayer, praying for recovery. And then also in China, and also in other places like Indonesia, I've discovered that drinking cold water is not considered good for health. So we have all these ideas, but where do they come from? Are they intuitive? Because they're not necessarily part of the established medical field, whether it be Western allopathic medicine or traditional Chinese medicine. They might be, but it's an open question. Are they rooted in intuitive understandings of the body and of the person? So the causes of illness are usually not obvious, and so this lack of transparency kind of opens the door for a variety of explanations involving invisible entities. So it could be germs, or it could be demon possession. How do we know? And what about vital energy? What is the role that vital energy might play in illness? So in sum, as people make sense of illness, we can identify a number of beliefs and variations of beliefs that people may have concerning illness. So different aspects of a person can be affected by illness. So it could be the soul, if we're affected by demons, it could be the mind, it could be the body. And there are different causes of illness. It could be physical, it could be emotional, psychological, spiritual. And the believed cause can influence treatment decisions. If you think it's biological, you're going to look for a biological treatment. But if it's spiritual, if you believe it's spiritual, then perhaps taking a pill might not actually treat, or you might not believe that taking a pill will treat that illness. So how do ideas of immaterial personhood influence folk medicine? So if we step away from the biology, the person is viewed as permeable. How do people think that the immaterial and the supernatural can interact with the body? So one way that it's been proposed and examined that supernatural persons can affect people is via possession. And the effects of possession are usually manifested in the body and in bodily behaviors. And anthropologist Emma Cohen has suggested that there are two models of spirit possession that draw on two different inference systems, cognitive inference systems. So there are two types. There's executive possession and pathogenic possession. And executive possession is defined as involving a transfer of mind, or identity. So you have the spirit that comes in, displaces the mind of a host, and kind of takes executive control over their body. Whereas pathogenic possession involves spirits as the source of illness. So you've got the spirit as like a pathogen coming and infecting the person. So given Emma Cohen and Justin Barrett's proposal that personhood notions involve three components: mind, personal essence, and vitality, I propose that maybe there's a third type of spirit possession. Maybe there's another way that the spiritual can interact with the body, and that's vitalistic possession. So maybe energy can also possess and influence the body. But how is vitalism different than contagion? So we have these unobservable entities that produce these observable effects, but what is the difference? How do we define vital energy, life force, spirit, and what are its characteristics? So first of all, vital energy is unobservable, but it produces visible effects. So similar to contagion, it can increase or decrease, and it can come and go. It can be transferred, so from food to the body via nutrition, and from agent to agent. And it has movement, flow, and force, and it may have positive or negative valence. And similar to vitalistic reasoning, the idea of contagion also involves the conception of an observable entity in essence that moves and is transferred from a source to a target and produces observable effects. So do contagion and vitalism draw on the same reasoning, or is there some kind of difference? So according to developmentalist Chuck Halish, contagion refers to the idea of transfer of contamination from one object to another. And so in terms of illness, these processes are considered negative. However, contagion can also be positive and is not always restricted to the physical domain. So Nemiroff and Rosen identify a number of principles of contagion that they argue govern the thinking of the transmission of contagious entities. So they posit that either direct or indirect physical contact is required for transmission. We're not sure if this actually applies to vitalistic causality. It's an open question. But in addition, they also suggest that contamination involves relatively permanent effects. So in order to, it's irreversible. It needs to be treated, whereas vitalism is not necessarily permanent. It might come and go. And similarly, there's also a quality where the part is equivalent to the whole in contagion. So, for example, if you have the finger bone of the Buddha, if you touch that, that's enough to receive a positive contagion, a blessing. You don't need to have the whole skeleton or the whole body, just one part is enough. And also, contagion is dose insensitive. It just needs to be a little bit. You know, if you drink contaminated water, just one microbe in there might be enough to contaminate, but that might not be the case for vitalism. I think that there might be a dose sensitivity there where more energy is going to have a greater effect. That's not how it works with contagion. So another aspect of contagion that they point out is that there appears to be a negative bias. So negative contagion appears to be far more frequent than positive contagion. So those are just some of the differences, the similarities and differences between contagion and vitalism. So really focusing on the dose sensitivity and possibly the direct or indirect contact. Now, as a developmentalist, I am looking at this from the perspective of looking at what do children know and how does that change through time, so with age. And so what do children understand about how people get sick? So the traditional understanding of illness, of children's understanding, the traditional view of children's understanding of illness from Piaget and others is that children thought that if you do something bad, that's why you get sick. So it's an imminent justice that explains illness. So moral violations lead to illness. But subsequent research has shown that among children, imminent justice reasoning is actually not that common. It's more common among adults. However, there is, and then also, so research by Chuck Halish and others show that children actually, even as young as preschool age, have demonstrated understanding of contagion in terms of illness causation. So they're not drawing so much on ideas of moral violations as Piaget suggested, but they're already understanding contagion early on. There have been some studies looking at beliefs in magical causes of illness, and the results of this are more that they're culture bound and found more among adults than children. And then there are other research that have examined theories of illness causation that have found evidence that people think about illnesses caused by cold or wet elements. So they call this cold-wet theory. So it's the idea that if something is too cold or too wet, that could lead to illness. And this has been found in cultures such as China, here in Hong Kong, Mexico, Guatemala, and even the US. So this is the example of the mother telling the child to put on their coat. And if you get wet or if it's windy, those kind of weather conditions might lead to illness. So what about research in China? Well, we have one study that was conducted by Li Qi, and she looked at children's beliefs about the causes of illness in China with her colleagues, and they asked preschoolers who were ages 3, 4, and 5 from urban and rural areas. They asked them the question they were in and around Beijing: why do people get sick? And they coded the responses as psychogenic, so deriving from thought, biological, behavioral, symptomatic, and irrelevant. And they found that adults provided primarily biological explanations, but they also liked psychogenic explanations. So about a third were psychogenic, so referring to emotion states. And the children provided behavioral explanations most often, so not wearing a coat, not eating enough food, for example. And in addition, the urban children provided more biological explanations than the rural children, who provided primarily behavioral explanations. So in the article, Li Qi and her colleagues argued that the children and adults didn't provide any vitalistic explanations, but I'm wondering if the behavioral and the psychogenic perhaps might be more in line with traditional Chinese medicine ideas. I mean, they might be vitalistic in some way, but it's difficult to kind of unpack that because it could be behavioral, but perhaps the underlying reasoning might be vitalistic. So, drawing on that, I think research concerning vitalistic causality in reasoning about the biology domain has been understudied in China. And in China, vitalism serves as the conceptual foundation of traditional Chinese medicine. So qi, which may loosely be translated as vital force or energy, is fundamentally important to health and the proper functioning of the body. And according to Lei, Li, and Askarov, to cultivate and regulate qi is the fundamental concern in the traditional Chinese concept of health and healing. If qi is weakened or the flow is blocked, a person is believed to become sick. And when a person dies, the qi is said to leave the body, although where does it go? That's something that our next study is going to examine. And so there's also suggestion that even though qi is considered to be biological, there might be a link to the supernatural as well. And so although individuals may be exposed to ideas from more established systems of medicine, whether traditional Chinese medicine or Western allopathic medicine, they might not necessarily hold views about illness that directly correspond with those ideas. So in addition, children with their developing cognitive abilities might be especially resistant or open to certain ideas within those established medical fields. So now I will tell you a little bit about the study that I did with Li Qi and her lab. So the questions based on kind of this theoretical background for my work package, we have another study which I'll mention at the very end, the future directions. So we're interested in, do Chinese children prefer vitalistic causes? Are they influenced by ideas from traditional Chinese medicine? Do they prefer vitalistic causes over other possible causes when they're given two choices? Do their preferences depend on age? Is there a developmental story here? And do children in rural areas of China show a greater preference for vitalistic causes than children from urban areas? So following up on that difference that Li Qi found with her colleagues. So in order to examine these questions, we interviewed 120 children from Hebei province, and we had 3 age groups, 4 to 5-year-olds, 6 to 7-year-olds, 8 to 10-year-olds, from rural and urban areas. And we had an open-ended question. I won't talk about that data right now, but we also had 6 vignettes, so 6 little stories that were accompanied by pictures of the characters. And so basically it was this character who had a symptom like a stomach ache or a runny nose, and the character had 2 friends. One had one idea about why their friend was sick, and the other friend had a different idea about why their friend was sick. And so then we'd ask, well, who do you think is right? And do you think they both could be right? So here is an example. So Ling Ling is not feeling well today. She has a stomach ache. Xiao Chen thinks that Ling Ling is sick because she ate an apple that fell on the ground and was full of germs. Yin thinks that Ling Ling is sick because she forgot to wear her coat and got cold, so she lost energy. Who do you think is right? And could they both be right? And so what we found is overall that children, regardless of age or region, in contrast to maybe what we expected or hoped, is that they chose contagion over the other options. So contagion was the most popular explanation for illness. But vitalism was preferred over other possible causes, such as psychological or imminent justice causes. And imminent justice was the least popular cause, although there were children who did choose that option. So here it shows the results of children. This is children's preference for contagion versus vitalism as the cause of illness by age group. So we have contagion on the right and vitalism. So this is just the number of children who chose. And so, I mean, contagion, it increased with age, children's selection of contagion. And the 4 to 5-year-olds chose vitalism more often than the older children. When we look at the rural versus the urban, what we find is kind of opposite to what we expected. So more children from rural areas than from urban areas chose contagion, and the reverse pattern is true for vitalism. So that was kind of contrary to what we expected given what Li Qi had found. Now, we also interviewed children in the US, in California and Michigan. And so here's a comparison also of contagion versus vitalism by country. So we have China on the left and the US on the right. So you can see contagion was still the most popular, but vitalism was more popular in China than in the US. But still, some children did choose vitalism over contagion. And then here it shows the breakdown by age. So vitalism was most popular with the youngest group of children in China. But the trend in the US is the opposite. So vitalism increased in popularity with age in the US.
What happened to the both responses?
Oh, I'm getting to that. Here they are. So we call this coexistence. So do they think that both responses could be right? And so what we did was we summed the scores across the stories for each participant. So it ranged from 0 to 6. And we found no significant differences between the 4 and 5-year-olds and the 6 and 7-year-olds, and between the younger age groups, and we also had adults. But the 8 to 10-year-olds, they were different. They seemed resistant. So this is just China here, but they were resistant to allowing for both explanations to be right. So there's something going on with the 8 to 10-year-olds. And we found a similar pattern with the US sample. So we also split them into different groups, but basically we found that the younger children were more open to the coexistence of multiple explanations, and the older children were not. It's just another way to look at it. And in terms of region, we found that children from rural areas were more open to coexistence than children from urban areas. They more often responded that only one friend could be right. So in conclusion, vitalism was the second most popular explanation. Contagion was the most popular, but vitalism still appeared to play a role, and there were also cultural differences between China and the US. So vitalism, as we would expect, figured more into children's understanding or their explanation for illness than it did for children in the US. And also the oldest children, the 8 to 10-year-olds, were least likely to accept that multiple causes could lead to illness. And we're going to extend this research by looking at vitalism in several other contexts. So looking at vitalism in afterlife beliefs. So what do people think happens to vital energy, to chi, when people die? Where does it go? And then also looking at vitalism and contagion in Holy Spirit concepts among Pentecostal and non-Pentecostal Christians. So Pentecostal Christians are those who they really focus on the aspect of God, the Holy Spirit, there are a lot of words that are used to describe the Holy Spirit in terms of energy and flame and electricity. So these metaphors seem to be they're suggestive of vitalism. So you want to see that when Pentecostals try and make sense of their experience of the Holy Spirit, do they frame it in terms of vitalism or kind of mind or executive possession, or is it more like contagion? And then, and then also comparing that with non-Pentecostal Christians. So thank you all, and I look forward to hearing your questions.